You know how in a game of Jenga, you can make one innocent move that looks completely safe, but that same move topples the entire tower 3 turns later? Well, that's like furnishing your first apartment. You make one rushed decision today, and for the next year, you're stuck compensating for it. But because nothing looks obviously broken, you keep investing time and money, hoping things will finally click. But your apartment doesn't need more stuff, it just needs a few well-made decisions. So in this video, I'll show you the 5 decisions you absolutely must get right to make your first apartment look and feel amazing. So unsurprisingly, one of the very first decisions you'll make in your first apartment is the main piece of seating, which almost always means a sofa. But a lot of people get this wrong because they treat their sofa like a temporary purchase. And so they order something that fits the layout of the room, is available online right now, and if they're lucky, matches some kind of vision they have for the color palette of the room. But the plan is generally the same. I'll upgrade this later. But what you don't realize is that this sets the stage for the demise of your apartment right from the get-go. Because your sofa isn't a neutral item. It's almost always the piece that the entire living room is built around, and it dictates some of the most important decisions about your living room. Its size determines how much floor space you have, its depth determines how you sit, and its shape determines where everything else is able to go. Because if your sofa is too small, your living room never feels settled. If it's too stiff, you won't actually use it. And if it's too shallow, you're constantly adjusting pillows to make the sofa tolerable. But once it's in the room, every other decision you make has to work around those constraints. And this is how rooms end up with extra chairs they don't need, furniture pushed up all the way against the walls, and layouts that feel cramped even when the room isn't particularly small. And all that happens because you're not designing the space from the ground up, you're compensating for a poorly chosen sofa. And so over time, the room feels crowded, unsettled, and just oddly uncomfortable, even though nothing is obviously broken. And this is why so-called temporary sofas stick around for years, because replacing them feels like a hassle, so instead, you just keep adjusting everything else around them. But to be clear, the issue here isn't price or even style. It's choosing a sofa without thinking through how you're going to actually use it day to day. Because a good sofa does a few things well. First, it's well proportioned for the room, which means wide enough to be the anchor of the room, but not so large that it eats up the entire floor. Second, your sofa should be legitimately comfortable in the way that you can sit back, you can put your feet up, and you could just hang out there without constantly shifting or getting uncomfortable. And then third, your sofa should work with your layout, so it doesn't force every other piece of furniture into awkward positions. Because if you've got a great sofa but everything else feels out of place around it, you don't have a great sofa. You just have a messy layout. But when you get the sofa right, the rest of the room becomes so much easier. Because choosing the rug and the coffee table and the lighting that complement that sofa isn't that hard if you know the basics around those items. But more importantly, people naturally know where to sit and how to move through your room. So if you're choosing a sofa for your first apartment, slow down and do a few practical things before you buy it. First, take a proper seat on the sofas you're considering. Not a quick 2-second test, but actually sit in them the way you'd sit at home. You know, really sink into them and kick your feet up. And if you're in IKEA and this feels awkward, don't worry about it. In China, people literally sleep in the beds at IKEA, so you should have no shame. Now, if the couch is comfortable, that's a good sign. But if you're immediately looking for throw pillows to fix the depth or, the angle of the back, that's a sign that it's not comfortable on its own. After that, you want to think about how you actually use your living room. So if you watch movies, then you're going to want a couch with some depth to it so you can really kick back. And if you host people regularly, then you want it to be wide enough for multiple adults to sit without needing a bunch of extra chairs. And if you often find yourself working or just reading on the sofa, then you're going to want armrests that support that. And I know it can be tempting, but generally it's a good idea to avoid oddly shaped sofas for your first apartment. Because any kind of overly curved or super low profile design will lock you into a single layout in your space. But a simple, well-proportioned shape gives you more flexibility in case you want to rearrange the room later. But you also want to think about what the sofa allows you to do next. Does it leave enough room for a properly sized rug? Can a coffee table fit in front of it without blocking movement paths? And can someone walk through the room without squeezing everyone else's knees? These kinds of questions are really easy to overlook when you're furnishing your first place, but they're exactly the kinds of questions you'll wish you asked a month from now. Of course, there's still more to think about when it comes to sofas, like leg height and the texture and color of fabrics, but this is more than enough to get you started. And remember, you don't need something expensive or perfect for your first place. Instead, focus on finding a sofa that fits your space, supports how you live, and doesn't force you to design around its shortcomings. That's how you avoid turning a temporary sofa into a long-term mistake. Now, once you've got your sofa in check, a lot of people think their living room is going to feel finished, but that couldn't be further from the truth. And part of the reason for that is that at night, there's a good chance your space still feels completely flat, and that's because of lighting. Because the reality is, most of the places you'll move into for your first apartment rely almost entirely on a single light source, which is the ceiling light. You flip it on when you walk in, turn it off when you leave, and that's it. And that technically works because the room is visible and nothing is broken, but visibility is not the same as atmosphere because overhead lighting completely flattens your space. It removes shadows and erases any form of depth, which makes even nice furniture feel strangely temporary, like the room hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. And this is why so many apartments still feel cold and impersonal at night. It's not that they're missing furniture, it's that all the light is coming from above, so nothing feels properly grounded. And because everything gets evenly lit that way, nothing feels particularly important. But something changes the moment you introduce a second light source. Something like a floor lamp next to the sofa, a table lamp where you actually sit in the evenings, or a wall lamp that adds a bit of glow without becoming the focus of the room. Suddenly, the room changes even without you moving a single piece of furniture. The corners of the room soften, some subtle shadows come back, and the space starts to feel nicely layered. But this isn't about making the room brighter, it's about where the light comes from. Because light that comes from the side or below eye level creates a new sense of comfort because that's how we experience light when we're at rest. And this subconsciously signals to us that this is a room where it's okay to slow down and stay a while. And this is also one of the fastest ways your first apartment will stop feeling temporary. Not by adding more stuff or spending more money, but by making the space work differently at night. Because once your lighting is layered like that, your room stops feeling like a blank box with furniture in it. It starts to have a mood, a clear shift between daytime and night. And just like the sofa, your lighting quietly organizes the rest of the room. It tells you where to sit and where to spend time. But on the other hand, when the lighting is wrong, people try to compensate for it with extra pillows, more art, and just more objects, but they never get the result they're looking for because they're trying to solve the wrong problem. So if your apartment feels fine during the day, but oddly uncomfortable at night, you want to look at your lighting. Because when your lighting starts working with your space instead of against it, your entire home takes a deep breath. And by the way, if you want to learn more about lighting, I recently released my 5-step lighting framework and a custom lighting tool where you can upload photos of your room and get back upgraded images to show you how your room could look if you really nailed the lighting. That's how you can go from a room that looks like this to one that looks like this in a matter of seconds. So if you want to do that for your own home, check out the link in the description. Now, another thing you need in your first apartment is a proper entryway. This is the first thing you encounter when you come home, and it's also the first thing guests interact with before they know anything else about your place. But because your entryway doesn't quite feel like a real room, a lot of people just overlook it entirely. They tell themselves that they'll deal with it later once the rest of the apartment feels done. But in the meantime, the same thing starts happening over and over again. Shoes end up in a loose pile, bags get dropped wherever there's space, and keys just get thrown on the nearest flat surface. But because everything is so disorganized, if anything goes even the least bit wrong, you misplace your keys or whatever, then all hell breaks loose and you're running around, tearing your entryway apart, trying to find the keys or cursing yourself for not being more organized. And while all this is happening, it feels like a life problem, but it's actually a friction problem. Because messes like these don't show up randomly. They appear in the areas of your space that don't give clear instructions. because when there's no obvious place for something to go, your brain defaults to the easiest option, which is just drop it, deal with it later, and move on. And when that happens every day, clutter builds up in your space really quickly. And that's why your entryway matters more than most people think. It's the transition zone between outside and inside, between movement and rest. And when that transition isn't well designed, the disorder you bring in with you from outside doesn't stay contained, it spreads. Now, a good entryway doesn't need to be large, and in your first apartment, it almost certainly won't be. You're not working with some grand foyer or anything like that. Most of the time, it's just a small bit of space near the door. And that's exactly why it matters that it's so well designed. Because what's important isn't fitting everything there, it's giving the things you use most a clear home. And shoes are the perfect example here. In a small space, trying to store every pair of shoes you own right by the door almost always backfires. It creates a ton of visual noise and just makes the area feel cramped. So instead, what works better is having a defined spot for the shoes you actually wear day to day, because when there's an obvious place for them, you're more likely to put them away instead of leaving them out. And then you can store the rest of your shoes somewhere else, like in a plastic bin under your bed or in another storage closet. This keeps your entryway much neater than it would have been otherwise, and it also means that you aren't tripping over your winter boots in the middle of July. And the same logic applies to bags and outer layers. When there's a simple hook or two within reach, things get hung up automatically. Not because you're super disciplined all of a sudden, but because the space makes the decision easy. And this is something that's actually really important, which is that you can use design to make up for the shortcomings in your personality. So even if you're not the most disciplined person, just by making some very small design changes to your space, you can start acting like a disciplined person who does all the things a disciplined person would do. And that's a really underappreciated aspect of great design. It helps you be a better person by making being a better person easier. And then there's everything else you're holding when you walk in. Keys, wallet, sunglasses, whatever you have in your hand when you open the door. And it's easy for those things to get misplaced if you don't have a defined surface or some kind of a tray that exists explicitly for the purpose of holding them. And that's why your entry has such an outsized effect on how your apartment feels. It's about what happens in the first 30 seconds after you walk inside. And when your entry tells you where your shoes, keys, and other belongings are supposed to live, everything else just gets easier. You come in, drop your things, and move on. No hesitation, no decision making, just a smooth experience. And that's really the goal here. Not to make your entry impressive, just to make it work quietly so clutter never builds up in your home in the first place. Now, we all know how important a good night's sleep is, but in many of our first apartments, we don't assign nearly enough importance to our bed. You settle for the bare minimum, but don't fully appreciate the cost of that decision. Because a lot of first apartments start the exact same way, which is just with a mattress on the floor. Now, I personally never did this, but I know a lot of people who have, and I can tell you it's not a good look. And yeah, I know you might have stayed at a Japanese-inspired hotel or seen some photos online of beautiful homes with beds on the floor. But if your execution looks more like this, which is the first apartment instantiation of this bed on the floor concept, you're not doing yourself any favors. And of course, bedrooms are a private space, and maybe you're a pure utilitarian who just wants a place to sleep and doesn't care about how it looks or feels. But then why are you watching this video? You are lost, my friend. But for everyone else who wants to feel good in their bedroom, I've got a few things to say to you. First, sleep isn't just about the number of hours. It's also about how well your body is able to rest and reset. And when you're sending your body cues that your bed is temporary and your room is unfinished, the quality of your sleep will decline. You sleep, but you don't really fully recover. And over time, that shows up in other areas of your life too. Specifically, you have less energy, which means the problems in your life feel tougher to tackle, and your entire apartment starts to feel more demanding, not because it is, but because you're running on less fuel than you need. But a good bed setup doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to feel intentional. Even something as simple as getting the mattress off the floor can change the entire dynamic of the room, because elevating your bed gives it presence. It signals that this is a place meant for long-term rest, not a temporary crash pad. And while you're at it, make sure that your bed is comfortable. I mean, this may sound obvious, but getting new pillows and comfy bedding you actually like really makes a world of difference. I know for some people it's tempting to say, the stuff I have is already good enough. But if you have pillows you've been sleeping on for a decade and bed sheets that look like they've been through World War III, you're really selling yourself short. And I promise you, it's worth the 50 or 100 bucks to upgrade your pillows and bedding to something better. You're gonna notice it from the very first night. But notice how I'm not talking about making your bedroom impressive. I'm talking about how to make it supportive of the rest of your life. And that's why treating your bedroom as an afterthought in your first apartment is such a common mistake. Not because your bedroom needs to look perfect right away, but because it has such a big impact on how well everything else works. So while your bedroom might feel less urgent than your living room, it's still one of the most important parts of your first apartment, so make sure you aren't overlooking it. And now for number 5 on this list, let's take things up a notch and start to elevate your space a bit. Because you may have noticed that even when everything in your first apartment is technically there, the sofa, the lighting, and a working layout, it still feels a bit unsettled. And the reason for that is often right under your feet. Of course, I'm talking about a rug. And rugs are often treated as optional, something you may add into your room at the end once everything else is done. And because of that, they're usually the first thing people skip when they're trying to save money or just simplify decisions, which is basically everyone who's furnishing their first apartment. But in reality, rugs do way more than most people realize. Because rugs aren't just decorative, they define territory in your home. A rug tells the room where one zone ends and another zone begins, and it gives your furniture a shared foundation so it stops feeling like a collection of unrelated pieces. And the presence or absence of rugs becomes especially noticeable in small open spaces like studio apartments where there aren't clear boundaries between living, sleeping, and dining areas. And when there's no rug, nothing tells you where one area ends and the next area begins, so the space feels loose and unsettled, like everything could be arranged at any moment. And so instead of feeling like a place you're meant to settle into, the room feels like it's still waiting for structure. And that's why when there's no rug, people often push all the furniture to the edges of the room. They're unconsciously trying to create space. But what actually happens is often the opposite. The center of the room becomes empty but useless, and the edges start to feel heavy and crowded. But once a rug is introduced, the logic completely flips. Because a rug separates a seating zone from the rest of the room, which allows different functions to exist side by side without bleeding into each other. But this is also where a lot of people go wrong. Not by skipping a rug entirely, but by choosing one that's too small. Because a rug that only sits under the coffee table doesn't anchor anything, and it actually shrinks the seating area because it just looks so small itself. The furniture still feels separated from each other, and it's just awkwardly gathered around what looks like a towel in the middle of the room. But a properly sized rug allows the main pieces of furniture to sit on it, not around it. And this visually pulls them together and gives the room weight. And so the space stops feeling scattered and starts feeling deliberate. Now, what's important here is that this isn't about pattern or style. It's really about function. The rug's job is to support the layout of the room. And just like with lighting, it influences everything else. It affects how people move through your space, where they sit, and even how sound behaves because it makes the room feel less sharp and more comfortable to be in. So if your living room still feels unfinished after you've positioned all your major pieces of furniture, you might want to look down, because the issue is often that your room doesn't have a solid foundation in the form of a properly sized rug. So most people think furnishing their first apartment is about collecting the right objects. Like, if you just get a sofa, a lamp, a bed, and a rug, your place will automatically feel like home. But that's not true, because even if you buy these things, if you make the wrong decisions around them, your entire apartment suffers. If the sofa's wrong, you don't just have a bad sofa, you have a living room that never quite feels right. If the lighting's wrong, you don't just have a poorly lit room, you have a space that never fully allows you to rest. And if the rug is wrong, your home will always look like it's only half done. And that's because these aren't decorative decisions, they're foundational decisions. They quietly shape how your apartment works, not just how it looks. When you get them right, everything else gets easier. But when they're wrong, you spend months compensating for them without realizing why your home never quite feels finished. So if you want to build on what you learned here and discover one of the easiest ways to make your apartment truly special, watch this video next where I'll walk you through a unique framework I've developed that anyone can use to make their home look and feel a whole lot better.